when it comes to like getting used to heavier weights, for example, one of the best things that has worked really well for my population is something I call the double up rule. So everybody knows like rep ranges that we usually stick to. And I pretty much on all my programs have it so that it's 8, 10, or 12 reps. And I tell them 8 is really 4 to 8, 10 is really 5 to 10, and then 12 is really 6 to 12 for the purpose of if you can do all of those sets for all of the reps with a certain weight, then you go up because it's double the minimum. So it's like if you can do, say, 2 sets with 20, then go up for 25, and you only have to get half the reps.
Let's link up with Krysta on the Fix. She's a wellness coach with a focus on mental well-being and physical strength.
Hey, Fix listeners, welcome back to our latest episode of the Fix Podcast. I'm your host, Krysta Huber, and today I am welcoming my friend, fellow nutrition coach, Bryan Fitzsimmons to the Fix Podcast. Just two New Jersey coaches chopping it up, talking all things fitness, nutrition, but a lot around mindset and really around application and implementation of what truly makes habits stick, how to genuinely drive behavior change that is going to last. No quick fixes, none of that BS that we just frankly don't have time for because it keeps us stuck on that hamster wheel of dieting and considering diets as ineffective, considering diets as things that do not work. Bryan and I share a lot of the same coaching philosophies, principles, and practices. And I had the pleasure of joining him on his podcast not too long ago. So we were well overdue to make the podcast swap. If you guys caught the episode that I did with him, I actually re-aired it not too long ago this fall from when we had done it a few months prior back in the spring. I re-aired it on my show so that you can kind of hear a little bit more about my story. And now you get to hear him in the interviewee seat. So really excited about this one. A lot of the topics we covered, we recorded this a few weeks back just before Thanksgiving, as you'll hear. But as we approach the week of Christmas and New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, and, you know, the classic time of January 1, what are we doing? What are we doing to get started on our journey? We really dive into ways that you can rethink how you approach fitness and nutrition so that you get the change that you do desire and you don't wind up being the person who said they were going to do one thing at the beginning of the year and finds themselves 11, 12 months later in the same exact position they were in before. So if something in here resonates with you, if you recognize that you do need outside support for this, please reach out to me. Send me a DM at the Krysta Huber. I'm also excited to share that we are now officially accepting FSA and HSA payment as an option to invest in the Fitness Fix coaching programs. So if that is something that you happen to have access to through your insurance, a lot of people are completing their open enrollment this time of year and looking at those options. So definitely consider it. Reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any questions about it for you. But there really is not a better time than right now. And it doesn't matter the time of year. I could say that literally any day of the week, any month, but there's that classic push and pull to wait until January 1st. It doesn't make a difference. Whatever you need help with, you are going to need support with inside of the month of December, just as much as you would in January, February, March, and so on. So take action. People who achieve results, the reward comes to the action taker. So be that action taker. And with that, let's welcome Bryan to the Fix Podcast. Bryan, welcome to the Fix Podcast. So excited to have you. Long time coming. We've been saying for like months and months to do a podcast swap. So it's finally here. I appreciate you. And I'm excited for the Fix listeners to hear from a fellow New Jersey guy, although you've now made your way down to the Carolinas, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But for all of my guests on the show, I like to kick things off on a fun note. You know me, I'm a big coffee drinker. So I got to know, what is your go-to coffee order? What are you sipping on in the morning to get your day started?
Oh, my fiance is going to hate me for this, but I am not a coffee drinker.
That's okay. You're allowed to be.
I will say though, I was at Vigor Ground for the Vigor Ground Summit and someone bought me a coffee. So I had to partake being in Seattle and it was okay.
Yeah.
But I start every morning off with a Celsius and preferably either orange, strawberry guava, kiwi guava, or the apple one.
So I have to ask, did you just never get into coffee like when you were younger? So you just like never really tried it, or do you like genuinely dislike the taste?
I tried it too early. It's kind of like when you get a
Mm.
taste of beer early on. Like I wasn't much of a drinker, like
Yeah,
compared to my peers
sure.
until I got to college because I tried beer and I tried coffee way too soon. And apparently it was very intentional on my dad's part.
He knew
So
what he
he's
was
like,
doing.
yeah, he's like, all right, so here, have a sip. No worries. And then it worked like a charm. Didn't want either.
Yeah. Okay. Well, parenting tips that we're not at that stage of life yet, but hey, we may need that in the future.
Hey,
That's
it's
so
something only
interesting.
an Irish parent could pull off with the beer.
Yeah, really, right? But it is interesting. Like I always get, I think people would actually be surprised. Like for people who listen to my show often, every like few guests, the person will say they don't drink coffee. So it's not as uncommon, right? But I
Yeah.
do appreciate that you have like the go-to caffeine regardless to still get your day started. And a lot of people also have come along the journey of like cutting out coffee because they realized it wasn't the best choice for them. So hey, different
Yeah.
strokes
And
for different folks, as the saying goes, right?
yeah, and funny story, as soon as I started my own thing when I was still working at my old gym, my
Mm-hmm.
boss, the owner of the gym, saw me drinking on a Monster and he knew I was leaving to do my own thing and he's like, "Get used to it, bud." And I'm like,
That's
"Oh,
actually really
so."
funny.
He's like, "You're going to be a caffeine addict. It's just part of the deal."
It really kind of is. Like people always ask me, where did my coffee love start? And it started, and I had to pare it back from being a group fitness coach because I woke up multiple days a week at 4 a.m. And you've been in this mode too. We've talked about this together when I was on your podcast. And you get into this like rhythm of, okay, well, I'm teaching 5, 6, 7, 8 a.m., little break mid afternoon. Then you go back again and you teach again at night. And then you got to wake up and do it all over. So my clients got to the point where they knew my coffee order and they would bring it to me, which was like so nice, but so dangerous. So some mornings by 8 a.m., I was easily on cup number 2, 3 because we started early. And that was really like where maybe it was like a little bit too much for me, but that was my story with
Yeah.
it.
Every client who's like, "How are you so peppy?" It's like, "Oh, that makes sense."
Yeah, my 3 shots of espresso from Starbucks, that
Yeah.
was my go-to order.
I was at my worst. I was at 2 Bang Energies a day. There was
Uh,
one for the start and one for the middle of the day.
oh my gosh. Well,
So
yeah, hey,
600 milligrams, who
yeah,
cares?
getting it in however you can. Well,
Yeah.
as I've already alluded to, we both personally have a lot in common and just kind of like our fitness journeys have been professionally really similar. So I'm sure we're going to dive into that over the course of this conversation. But I like to take a little bit of a different approach with guests. Instead of you riffing off your resume and the qualifications that you have and your coaching experience, you and I both know as podcasters, there are so many podcasts out there. There are so many podcasts people can opt to listen to. And to really get the FYX listener into this particular conversation, I want to know, like, who is Bryan as a person, like at your core? And inside of that, why should we care about what you have to say?
Wow. Starting off with a zinger. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, if I was to describe myself, I'm just like on this never-ending journey to try to understand people because I want to know what the
Like
heck
that.
makes them tick so that way we can actually create lasting change instead of being in this roller coaster of, all right, do this workout, do this diet, and nothing ever changes. So that's basically what's guided my learning to the point where like I work with mostly moms 40 plus. So I have dove all in on the menopause certifications and things like that. I've gone down the rabbit hole of pain-free training and all that good stuff. So that's basically what's led me to where I'm at today.
I love that. I didn't know what you were going to say, but I wasn't expecting that answer. And we're both big on the concept of habits and really reinforcing positive nutrition practices and fat loss that's actually lasting change in that way. And I know that's something that we have in common with our coaching styles, but I think for us to really kind of paint the picture of who you work with and the way you think and how you coach, how did a guy like yourself wind up focusing on this population? Because, it's pretty niche, but I think even for the two of us as younger coaches, a lot of the times the people that we work with usually represent like who you are in proximity. And I would say you and I are a little bit different in that regard, that we tend to coach people who are several years older than us. And personally, I love that. Like I learned so much from my clients, but you kind of break the stereotypes of what you would expect for like a male fitness coach. So unpack that part of your story for us.
Yep, I love talking about this because, like, in the beginning, I did not want to be a personal trainer. Like, right behind me is my criminology degree, and I wanted to be a police officer or a firefighter. And for those who don't know, in Jersey, it is one horrible process trying to get
And
on a
it's
civil
really
service job.
intense.
It's very intense. And, like, for example, for a state trooper job, there was one position and 10,000 people applied. So that gives you an idea. So you're kind of on a waiting list forever, and you get
Mhm.
lucky if you're lucky. So in the meantime, needed a job. So I was working out with my buddy and I'm teaching him how to do like a reverse fly and he can't feel it at all. I'm coaching him up and he's like, "Oh, I get it now, dude. You're kind of good at this." And I'm like, "Maybe I should try personal training." So I did that, got a cert, and ended up at my first real official job at Get in Shape for Women, which is basically like a curves. If anybody's familiar with that, I'm sure the people listening are.
Mhm.
And it was just me, one dude. I was one of two male trainers out of like six or seven that were rotating through. And I'm training all these ladies that are like 40, 50, 60, 70, 80. I think I worked with a woman in her nine. Yeah, I did work with a woman in her
That
90s
is
at
so
one point.
cool.
And outside looking in, you're like, man, that must have sucked. But I'm like, I had the time of my life. I love those ladies. They were incredible. We had a blast. We would literally just shoot the shit. We would
And
just,
they wanted to be there.
yeah, they
That's
wanted to
to
be
me the
there.
game changer.
Exactly. So that place, unfortunately, business wise, wasn't doing too well. So they went under. And in the process of them closing up shop, I looked for a new place and I landed on the place where I really cut my teeth with the training and the nutrition side of things at a gym called Gabriel Fitness in Berkeley Heights, New Jersey. Still there if you guys are in the area. One of the best gyms in the entire nation. And I have no hesitation saying that because the education I received there, because they focus pretty much only on the 40 plus population, was second to none. So a lot of people in our space learn all these things at certifications and they're like, oh, this is the way. But then they never actually test it out to see if it works. I
Mhm.
got the very rare opportunity to test it out, like all the things I learned on 300 plus people that happen to be over the age of 40. So I learned all that stuff. And eventually I got to a point where I'm like, I want to do it my way. I'm just that type of person where I'm like, I can't work for somebody else forever. So that's where I am now, basically taking all the stuff I learned there and fine tuning it and making it into my best version for serving people online remotely.
What would you say was the biggest surprise about working with this population of women? Like, you just said it. So many people are like, did you like that? Like, would you really like that experience? And I totally agree with you. Like, it's very, I think, very rewarding.
It's very rewarding. And honestly, as a coach, it's so much easier working with this population because they don't bullshit. Like, I'll ask them, "So, how are you feeling?" And they'll be like, "Well, let me tell you." And then they just lay it out there. And I'm like, as a coach, that's exactly what you want. You want the
Yeah.
whole laundry list because then you could pick it apart and be like, okay, we can improve this, we can improve that. Meanwhile, like, I love the dudes too, but at the same time, you're just like, "How you doing?" And they're like, "Living the dream."
And they're like, good. Yeah.
Yeah.
They don't
And
give
it's
you a
like,
lot to work with.
so what do we do with that?
Right. Yeah, that's so true. That's such a good point. I never really thought about that because you get kind of like siloed into the population that you work with the most. And personally, I started in the group fitness space with women, a little bit younger age population, but a big range. And I never really thought about making that comparison. And I only have like a handful of male clients, most of whom are somebody's boyfriend, partner, brother, whatever, like they have another connection to my program. And it is really true. Like you do get a lot more of the here's exactly what's going on from the ladies. And this is a reminder to guys to, put effort into your communication and be in touch with your emotional side because there's a lot to uncover there. But on kind of like the flip side of that, the other question I have with thinking about this population in particular is about your transition to online coaching. Naturally, things have changed for people ever since 2020 and COVID and interacting online and kind of making this be like a very common practice for coaching. But what was it like for you initially, or maybe how have things been for you as serving this population? Like, I do think sometimes there can be a little hesitation around technology. So, how does that show up inside of your business?
Absolutely. And honestly, during that time, like during COVID times where we had to shift everything online, I have mixed feelings about it because I'm like, oh, I wish I jumped onto my doing my own thing at that time because that's when so many
Mhm.
businesses boomed.
Sure.
But being that there was that giant population of people to work with online, it was like a masterclass in how to communicate with people when you physically can't move them in the direction that they want to go, or just
Yeah,
getting better at communication in general when you're not face to face. So whether that's through text messaging, emailing, whatever. And that is a very hard skill to learn that I think a lot of businesses that are in the remote space really struggle with,
for
is
sure.
communicating effectively without being on the phone or in person.
Yeah, because they
So
don't know any different.
exactly. So basically, when it comes to the whole technological side of things, ease of userability, I guess, if that's a
Mhm.
word, is probably
Yeah.
like number one on my priority list, which is why I actually shifted away from the software I was using to a new one, because it's so much easier. It's just click this button, click that button. It's not a lot of work on their end. And I've also shifted to a lot more voice memoing. So it's like you can
Cool.
get tone, you can get a little bit more that people need. So it's like it for my population, they prefer it that way and they seem to receive it better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, I just want to underscore something you mentioned about like not being able to like physically see the person or even like move their body, like in trying to describe a certain exercise to them. But on top of that, too, I think there is often the assumption that a lot of women, especially women who are currently in their 40s plus, they received the message of cardio, 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 cardio in their 20s, right? So there's the
Yep.
intimidation factor of being in the gym, specifically in the weight section. So, how have you seen that evolve for the people that you work with in them building the confidence to actually walk into the gym by themselves because they don't have you there in person?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll say this to start. First, most of my clients still work out at home. They just upgrade their dumbbells and
Cool.
get to the point where they can handle more because time wise, just like comfortability, they
It's more
make really,
efficient.
really good progress. Because at the end of the day, all I really care about is, are they happier, healthier, and is their body composition improving? And I don't care what setting they do that in.
Hmm.
But there have been some that do make the transition to the gym and they're like, oh my God, this is incredible. And I'm like, I told you. But
Yeah.
when it comes to like getting used to heavier weights, for example, one of the best things that has worked really well for my population is something I call the double up rule. So everybody knows like rep ranges that we usually stick to. And I pretty much on all my programs have it so that it's 8, 10, or 12 reps. And I tell them 8 is really 4 to 8, 10 is really 5 to 10, and then 12 is really 6 to 12 for the purpose of if you can do all of those sets for all of the reps with a certain weight, then you go up because it's double the minimum. So it's like if you can do, say,
Oh,
2 sets
yeah,
with 20, then go up for 25, and you only have to get half the reps. Like if you're doing 10, for example, and you get 10 on both of those sets,
sure.
awesome. Go up 5 pounds and just tell yourself, I only need to get 5. We'll find out if I can get more, but 5 is just the bare minimum. And based on weight math, that should be possible every single
Single
time.
time. Yeah. I love that. It's like that's super easy to remember. And I also think, for me personally, this is something that we totally have in alignment with the way we coach is like, we don't need to have somebody make a complete 180 on something. And it works in the direction of strength training, but also even thinking about food choices, total calories, etc. Something that I see that I think we might, I don't know that we got into this in a ton of detail in the episode that I did with you, but I see this all the time with nutrition where a lot of women, let's talk protein, are very intimidated by trying to increase that number. So for the
Yeah.
first week of working with me, I just have you eat how you normally eat. And then I want to see where you land. A lot of coaches, and I believe this is a mistake, and this is my personal opinion, are too quick to assign someone macros before they even look at their current, like, what's their current capacity?
Yep.
And you take this person who, if they're being really honest, is like maybe getting 80 grams of protein, if that, they don't even understand what 80 grams of protein looks like. And then they have a coach throw them like 150, 160 grams of protein when, again, the person doesn't even know what that means. And they see that number and they're like, holy shit, I need to double my protein starting tomorrow. So what I do instead is I take the first month to gradually increase their protein. The same could apply for carbs and fat in either direction, and say to them, hey, like, this week, let's increase this by 10 grams and then show me that you can do that. And then let's increase it by 20 and then let's increase it by another 10. And all of a sudden we're 30 days in and you have gotten to the 150 gram target, but it didn't feel like this insane mountain to climb at this like extreme vertical right from the jump. So I feel like that principle is the same in what you're describing, especially the part where like you're telling yourself, well, I only need to get 5 more reps. I only need to get 6 more reps, because once you get the first 3, you're usually like, yeah, I got this and I can keep going. So I'm curious if what your take is on that, even as it applies to food too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I've actually, like, over the past, I'd say 6 months, changed my program a little bit in a similar way, where it's like what I have people do now is embrace the concept of PFC. And basically it's like my like easier version of tracking. So it's like, hey, I experienced a lot of people when they went to straight to calories and straight to macros that, like, no matter what we did, it just, they can never get enough steam to do it correctly and accurately. So I was like, what are we really doing here?
Sure.
We really need to learn the food skills and understand where these sources come from, because a lot of people, they're like, oh, I have this much protein. And then they're like, how do I get that? And then they get it from sources that are very fatty. And they're like, okay, I'm getting my protein, but I can't. Now it's out of balance. I can't stay within my calories. So instead, I'm like, okay, why don't we focus on the sources first and kind of put you in a situation where you're most likely going to lose weight anyway. So you're going to get the success that you want, that you came for, and you're also going to learn the skills. And if we need to crank it up, we can. So like what I have them do is like 3 to 6 palm-sized servings of protein a day. And starting at 3, like just 1 at breakfast, lunch, dinner, or if they barely get any, just try and get like more. So if they don't have it at breakfast, let's put it in breakfast. Or if they don't have it at lunch, in lunch. And also, while they're understanding, where do I get protein? Where do I get fiber from? Where do I get color from? It's like, while we're doing that, I'm having them figure out the skill of measuring their food. So it's not, oh, I have to measure this and fit it in like it's a puzzle piece that I don't even know what the picture looks like. It's, oh, this is just the skill of weighing out a portion.
Yeah, because so many people, when they try to think like, oh, I'm going to go track my food by myself, I'll use an online macro calculator, and like, that's fine. But if you don't know what 150 grams of protein even means, if you don't know what that looks like, the number legitimately means nothing to you. And so then we really start to struggle with the application. And if we want to bring this thought back to what you said at the very beginning of this, of like understanding why people think the way that they do, there is a huge psychology piece in setting up a system for someone to guarantee their success versus not guaranteeing their failure, but almost kind of ensuring their failure, because it's overwhelming, right? Like if you take a person who's never tracked their food in any sort of way, and then you're like, okay, we need to do this. I need to teach you what protein is. I need to teach you what carbs are. And the example of what you mentioned about like the sources with protein and fat is a huge one, right? And that trips so many people up. And then they're sitting there and they're like, well, I thought I was making healthy choices. Like, I don't understand why this isn't working. And they get that reinforcement of, oh, I'm not doing this right. This must be too hard. I can't do this. This isn't easy. Then it starts to feel complicated. And who the heck is going to stick to something if that's the talk track that they have around it?
Yeah, I keep hearing this like voice in my head, and I swear to God, I'm not mentally ill, people, but I keep hearing the letters SEE, simple, easy, and effective, where it's like, or sorry, simple, easy, and enjoyable. Maybe it needs another E, but like that's really what people lean towards. That's what people gravitate towards when they have a behavior. Is it simple to follow? Is it easy? Like, is it relatively easy to implement? And am I actually enjoying this? Because people jump on these diets and they're like, I'll figure it out at the end. I'll figure it out. I'm going to buckle down right now and then I'll figure it out. And then it's like, you just regain all the weight and you feel like horrible about yourself. And now you're in a worse situation and you're proving the statistic right that diets don't work.
Right. Exactly. I love that acronym. So totally stealing that from you. I couldn't agree more. I literally just did it.
You heard it here first, people. I'm throwing a TM on that.
There you go. Go right to the trademarking office. I recently did 2 posts about this, like over the course of the last 2 days, around there's a difference between understanding that fat loss is simple and accepting that it's not necessarily easy. And in my opinion, that has a lot to do with your environment. And I just did a post about this morning. I recently moved, and I moved into a much bigger building, and, you know, working remotely and working from home, you like observe a lot of stuff that happens in the building throughout the day. I'm taking my dog out. I see a lot of things. And I have never seen so many DoorDash and Uber Eats deliverers, to the point where if I'm in the elevator with someone, 9 times out of 10, they do not live in the building. They are a DoorDash person. And so I started thinking about this as a phenomenon, and I know it exists and I know it's true, but like it just really magnified how real this actually is. And the lesson there is that's why fat loss feels hard, right? That's why it doesn't feel easy, because we have food available to us at our fingertips. So therefore we have a responsibility to control our environment. But in the same token of everything we've talked about up until this point, my advice with that isn't to say like, oh, screw DoorDash and Uber Eats, never order it again, because that's taking you cold turkey. And we know that doesn't work. Yeah. The advice is, if you do this 4 times a week, can you cut it down to 2? If you do this 3 times a week and you're still not getting the results that you want, can we understand that this is where it can get simple and, dare I say, easy? Because to me, it is low-hanging fruit to cut out that order, and especially low-hanging fruit to cut it, in half versus actually eliminate it.
Yeah. And that's honestly turned into like my favorite check-in question ever since I implemented it, because I had somebody where I'm like, why is she not losing weight? Like, our calories are lining up perfectly. She's exercising consistently. What the hell gives? Sure. And I actually consulted with Jim Hallen and Jimmy Nutrition, and he's like, did you ask him how often they eat out? And I'm like, oh,
you're like,
that's
why didn't I ask that?
Yeah. And then I asked her, and she's like, well, 4 or 5 times, because I'm just always on the go with the kids because they got a million sports. And I'm like, well, that makes total sense in a million different ways. So let's figure that out. And then all of a sudden, everything started moving in the right direction. So people don't really understand that eating food that you did not personally prepare makes it so much harder. And I think along with Jimmy providing that amazing advice, another person I've learned a lot from is Jen Brocksterman. She was on the Mind in the Macros podcast with Mike Dola and Jeb Stewart-Johnson. And she said something and it just smacked me across the face. I'm like, that is so good. She's like, make this healthy choice the easy choice. And it's like, it sounds so simple, but we never actually do it. Like, do we formulate our fridge in a way where the healthy stuff is staring us in the face? Or do we have it so that it's just how we've always grown up with that fridge looking, and we are more tempted to eat the things we know we shouldn't actually be eating?
Yeah, that's so true. I think, like, first of all, love that you started asking that question, because that's one that every time when my clients first get started and I put that on their check-ins, they're like, why are you having me look at this? And it becomes a really clear story, because I'll then show them the difference between them and their progress versus the person who rarely eats out. And what I'll also add too is actually counting it over the course of the week allows you to zoom out. It allows you to have the perspective of how frequent is this actually happening? Because if we use your example of your client, right, who it makes perfect sense, her logic of being like, well, I'm rushing with my kids. That's when you almost don't start to notice, because it's your autopilot, it's your default. So you don't even recognize that that may be a limiting factor for why you're not getting the results that you desire, right? And then when you tally it up at the end of the week, you're like, oh, and then I can literally show you the person who only eats out once or twice and look at the difference in their progress. And it's usually just a question of speed. So many people come to you and they're like, I want to be able to achieve this simpler, but also faster. Well, that's one of the easy ways to do it. And it's not to say we can't go out to eat. It's just understanding what is the implication of that, and understanding if you tweak the amount of times it's happening, what can that do for your progress in a certain amount of time? And I think that really allows people to get away from like the all or nothing mindset or things feeling so black and white, because the other end of the spectrum that I hear on this a lot too is like, sometimes people will be like, well, I shouldn't go out to eat at all because then I can't track it perfectly. And we're not saying that either. We're just saying that like there can be a sweet spot, and that's going to be individualized to you. But if we don't count that and we don't tally that up on a regular basis, how can we actually figure out what that sweet spot is? Number one. And then number two, also learning that there's seasons and reasons where this number of how many times we're ordering or going out may fluctuate, and recognizing that, okay, I like to do things like in a seasonal type of way, in the sense of like, in the summertime, none of my clients are in a deficit. And that's just because it doesn't make sense to do it then, because you have more travel, you have more question marks with your schedule, you want more flexibility. Same deal right now in the next few weeks as we roll through the holiday season. Not the best time to be in a deficit. Still a good time to have the support of a coach, because then it teaches us how much can I get away with? When can I loosen up the reins a little bit versus when do I have to like put my head down and actually do the work? And I know I said like 3 different concepts in there, so I'll let you respond to whatever's kind of sticking out for you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I honestly, I feel like we all have the same types of conversations where it's like, listen, like this is just probably not the right time for this. And I always frame it like, listen, this is always your decision at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give you the info you need and you tell me what we're doing. So like when they're in the power position and they're like, okay, I'm going to do this, then it's like, okay, now the autonomy increases,
Sure.
the adherence increases. So it usually ends up pretty well that way. And it just comes down to whatever they actually want and understanding the reality of the situation where it's like, all right, let's not play this game of where we go to fairyland and you're eating whatever you want and we're falling off the wagon and we're still expecting things to happen as if we were perfect.
Right. No, it's so true. The autonomy piece that you just mentioned is so important because I think people can come into the coaching relationship as the client with the expectation that we're here to just tell you what to do. And I've found that as I've become a more, experienced coach and a more seasoned coach over the years, I've learned how to be more confident in demonstrating to the client that it is in fact up to them to decide. And my responsibility is more so to show them here are the 2 to 3 options. And with each of these options, here is the potential outcome. What do you think makes the most sense for you? And I find that people who are newer to me, or maybe have had experiences with other coaches or zero coaching experience at all, sometimes when I ask them the question, they're like, what do you mean? Like, you're telling me that I'm supposed to decide? And it's like, yes, because this is your life. I don't know your schedule as well as you know your schedule. I also don't know the inside of your brain as well as you do, right? I'm trying to learn it, but I agree. I'm sure, like, I don't have a study to pull on for this, but I can guarantee just knowing this anecdotally and hearing you say it too, the level of compliance that goes up when the individual feels like they've had a lot more control and buy-in over that process is huge.
Yeah, and I think this is the issue a lot of people have. It's conflicting between what they need versus what they want, because a lot of people, what they want is that drill instructor to say, eat this, not that, or to literally slap food out of their hands. People are like,
Yeah.
oh, if I just had you living with me, I would get in such great shape. And it's like, yeah, and the second I move out, you're going to go right
And
back to the
what?
way you were. Okay.
Exactly.
But people need somebody to help them come to these decisions by themselves. Like, it's kind of like my big fat Greek wedding. Coaches are not the head. We are the neck. We help to
Such a
turn
good
the head
analogy.
wherever we want.
Yeah.
And you need somebody like that in your corner to give you the confidence to make the right decisions and give you the information you need to make an informed decision. So that way you can keep doing that over and over and over again.
Right.
Because it's like, if you want to change behavior in the moment, tell somebody they're wrong. Tell somebody don't do this. But if you want to change it for a lifetime, then you got to teach them how to fish. You got to teach them, like, how do I make this decision? Why do I make this decision? And in what situation am I able to make this decision versus that decision?
Yeah, that's so true. I think, love, first of all, my big fat Greek wedding reference, so spot on. But two, your point of like the contrast between, hey, if you want to be a drill sergeant, they will change in the moment versus for forever is huge, because you want somebody to get to a point where they don't need you anymore. And they see this as what I like to describe as, this is just who they are. Like, my job has allowed them to actually shift their identity to the point where they just show up as the person who makes the decision of prepping the food that takes maybe 15 minutes, that they could honestly cook faster than the DoorDash could even arrive. That doesn't mean that always has to be their go-to, but like, in their integrity is in alignment with 9 times out of 10, that is the way that I'm going to operate, because I literally see myself as a different person. And look, I think that's also the hardest part for the client listening to this who hears that. I want you to know, as somebody who's a client of coaches myself, that is a lifelong journey. That's not accomplished in 6, 12, or even 18 months, or whatever kind of amount of time you're going to spend with the coach.
Yep, absolutely. It's so spot on, because this is the conversations that people need to hear, but unfortunately it's drowned out by all like the rah BS on social media, or their local instructor that does it their way or the highway and has all these success stories of people that never actually kept the weight off. So it becomes conflicting and they're like, how can I believe this?
Yeah, so true. And, to the point of the conflicting information, you touched on this a few minutes ago, and I wanted to highlight it as well. Just knowing that there's also so much information out there. And we work with women who the populations we're talking about, they're busy. They have a lot on their plates. There's so much going on that they see our relationship and our role in their lives as a way to reduce some of that decision fatigue by reinforcing like, hey, here's the information to consider. Let's try this path. And from there, measure it consistently for several weeks to several months plus before we decide that this does or does not work for you. Right. And giving them that container, what I like to call just like actually giving somebody the structure where we're not necessarily giving them a meal plan, because we don't think that a meal plan and telling them exactly what to eat is going to serve them. But I like to use the comparison of like treating it like you're in like a sandbox, and like we created the outline of the sandbox and we have the structure of the sandbox mapped out for you. But there's lots of toys in the sandbox and you can play inside of the sandbox lots of different ways.
Yeah. And like when you talk about that stuff, honestly, it makes me think of, I know Aram goes off on this like multiple times about like how is everything disordered eating? Because at the end of the day, like this is a conflict I've had with some people who like sign on for my coaching. It's like they come in with these pasts of like disordered eating or full-blown eating disorders. Sure. And they are now in a position where it's like any sort of accountability tracking is a potential trigger according to what they have been told. So it's like now there's a lot of people who may not have gone down that route, because honestly, I mean, when it comes to mental health, it's very tough to navigate those waters. Sure. But there's people who aren't necessarily in that camp that are like basically inheriting these beliefs that, oh, if I do this, I'm going to have an eating disorder, or I'm going to have these disordered eating patterns. And then we create a situation where there's no accountability systems. How do we know if you are getting closer to your goal if we don't know how much you are actually consuming or how much you are actually exercising? It's like, yes, it sounds great to be like, just eat intuitively, just work out as best you can, do your best. And then people do that, but then they're still stuck, or they still move further and further away from their goal. So then now they're in this shitty situation of, all right, so what the hell do I do?
Yeah. And that's one of my biggest gripes with the concept of intuitive eating, because I find that the people who preach it the loudest are, especially when we tie like the disordered eating story to it. And look, like you're right, there is a time and a place and a space for that. And I actually had not too long ago, a podcast guest who created an app, a technology to help people with binge eating disorders, where you're just actually tracking the emotions around what causes the binge, how many times did you want it to happen, and like literally logging the data and using neuroscience as the way to coach the person to rewire their brain. But there's tracking involved in there for sure.
Yeah, that's an accountability system right there.
I loved that. And the person who created it, she went through this experience herself and found that that's what was missing, because going to a therapist's office for 1 hour every few weeks didn't actually allow her to fully heal the relationship with food. Because guess what? You still got to eat. So she could say whatever she wanted to say inside of that 1 hour session. And then it was like, well, what else are we doing here to actually change my behavior and hold me accountable? And so what I find to be frustrating is the individuals preaching around getting to a place of intuitive eating, they skip over the part of their story where they paint this picture of macro tracking, in particular, any kind of calorie tracking, as, really bad or triggering, like you said. But then what they don't recognize is if it was so bad, you're missing the point that actually allowed for you to be a more educated, intuitive eater. And yet you're sitting here telling somebody who's never tracked a damn thing in their life, that doesn't know what foods represent protein, carbs, and fat, trying to tell them that they should be able to eat intuitively. That's not fair, because they didn't go through the process that unfortunately you went through. And I'll go so far as to say, I haven't said this on a podcast in a long time because it hasn't come up, but I'll hear these stories of people being like, I brought my food scale on vacation. That was a choice. I never encourage that for a client. Keeping this relevant to the time of year that we're in, I don't tell a single client to track on Thanksgiving, Christmas, or New Year's Eve. If you, whatever you want it to look like in the in-between, my job is to tell you, if you choose X, here is the potential outcome. If you choose Y, you might get Z, right? But I think we're doing a huge disservice to people by like preaching this concept of like, well, everyone can eat intuitively. Guess what? For all I know about nutrition and all Bryan knows about nutrition, if I were to eat intuitively, I'd have ice cream at every single meal because like it tastes good. Who doesn't want that?
Yeah.
And I don't know
And
that that's going to serve my goals.
yeah. And if we're being honest, the real issue is not the methods, it's the implementation. It's the shit
Exactly.
implementation because
Yeah.
people just say, oh, it's just this. And it's like, no, like you and me both know when it comes to like calorie and macro tracking, it's not just tracking. It's not just like putting numbers in. It's like all the behaviors that surround it. And unfortunately, a lot of people tend to go towards the extremes because they're like, the more extreme I go, the better results I get. Right?
Hmm.
Wrong. And a lot of people adopt these behaviors that competitors do, and in a competitive setting, the only goal is win. It's not
Right.
let's preserve our mental health. It's not let's put ourselves in a really good position as far as health goes and long term health. No, it's I don't care what the hell I do to my body or my mental state. I need to win. And then people do things like bring their scale on vacation or they go out to dinner with pre-made Tupperware meals and you're just like that is not mentally healthy, that is not sustainable, and it's deteriorating the relationship that you have with food and with the people around you,
Yeah.
which is not sustainable long term.
Right. And like you're saying, it's not required for the context that 90% of the population lives their life in. But there is a pedestal around like the results of somebody's physique and the shape and the way they look and the speed at which they can do it. That's where I think it gets really blurry and misinterpreted for people because they're like, okay, if I want some version of that, don't I at least have to adopt some of that mentality? And it's like, no, not unless you have a specific goal. So it's just a reminder that if as a coach, if you're listening to this, always remembering that the client's goal has to be your North Star. But even as a potential client, somebody listening to this who maybe you don't work with the coach, have never worked with the coach, worked with one in the past, like whatever variation, or maybe you're just listening to this as a way to continue to self-educate, you need to keep your goal in mind and know that there are different methods, some of which can be, like you said, really crappy application. And it's that whole saying of like garbage in, garbage out, right? Before we started recording, we were talking about using AI for different features and different software. And to tie that back to fitness, I've seen people like make comments about like, could AI replace some of the work that you and I do? I never have that fear and I never will have that fear because we can't teach that computer system to have the empathy and like the real life scenario. And I guess you can, like, there is research showing that like you can talk to it in the same way. I've experimented with it, but I just don't see that as an issue. I see it as a way for me to potentially like work more quickly and then ultimately help more people. But I don't see it as something that's threatening for that reason, because if you put in something that's like, give me a, like I did this when Chat GPT first got popular. It was like, give me a 4-day workout program, like a traditional like bodybuilding split, 2 upper, 2 lower, and like I have X amount of time in the gym. That does not factor in how is the person sleeping? What are their stress management skills like? What does their diet look like? And sure, could you give that additional information? 100%. But guess what's still missing? The accountability and the application, because how the heck is that software going to check in with you to make sure that you're continuing to do it?
Yeah. I am so glad you brought up AI because I know we chatted beforehand, but
Yeah, it was just
I
on my mind for that reason.
I really love that AI is blowing up in our space because, I mean, this sounds a little bit jerky, but I really wanted to put all the shit coaches out of business. Like the ones
It's
that
not
tell you,
jerky. That's a good
but
point.
I want all those shit coaches to just like completely their businesses to fail because they're letting people down and creating horrible relationships with food and stealing money by promising people the world, saying you're going to get everything you need. I'm going to be there for you 100%. And people get a cookie cutter meal plan. They get the same workout everybody else is on. They're paying like up to $500 for their, and this is literally from hearing this from somebody's mouth. They pay
Yeah.
somebody $500 a month to send in every single thing. Like the coach didn't take the time to actually look at anything. They had to send all of their metrics, every single thing. And all they got in response was awesome. Good job.
I had that happen to a recent client too. And I felt so bad that that had happened to her because she was like, I just was told one thing on our initial call. And I was like, well, this sounds great in theory. So let me sign up. And that's a really good point. I didn't even think about it from that regard because you're right. If it's going to replace somebody, it will be that type of person because that is the kind of work that it can actually duplicate.
Yeah. I mean, then those people are just going to have to rely on photoshopping their pictures on Instagram and putting up motivational quotes so that they get sponsors, but they're not going to be coaches. So the world will
No.
be better for it.
Yeah, very true. You're right. It'll weed out the people who are not meant to be there and thinking about this with the same exact lens that we are. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. And as we come up on our last few minutes here, is there anything that you're just seeing recently, like among your clients, whether it is related to the holiday season, right? Just with that being like a big theme this time of year, or just anything that you're noticing is coming up like frequently as a typical theme that you're tending to coach people through?
Yeah, just like right now, because I don't know when this is coming out, but we're a week away from Thanksgiving,
Yeah.
literally a
I'll
week
drop
away.
this like the second week of December. So it'll be right before Christmas.
Perfect. Yeah, just I mean, holidays in general, it's always a thing where it's like we have all the stressors that we face once a year on top of the stressors that we have every day. So at this point in time, number one, just give yourself some grace. Do your best and acknowledge that you are doing your best, not holding yourself to this standard that's just not realistic for the time and place that you're in right now. So if that means just focusing on getting some form of protein on the plate, regardless of wherever you're at, that's a gigantic win compared to just saying, screw it until New Year's resolutions come along. And another thing too is just do your best to manage your stress as best that you can, whether that's by forming productive boundaries with those relatives that you just don't want to see. And
So true.
like just all the BS that comes with the holidays, that's the unenjoyable part of it. Do your best to keep yourself in a good headspace and do whatever is required for that.
For sure. It's, having the boundaries and honoring the commitment to yourself is what I'm hearing with both of those examples you're giving and saying, like, you don't just because you're seeing somebody doesn't mean you need to engage in a super long conversation with them. I think that's important to bring up in the context of people who make the comments about like what you're choosing to eat too, as another big one. And then, thinking about like the maintenance aspect of what you're saying of like, what is at least some kind of bare minimum that you can focus on where you're still getting your protein in, and also embracing that phase, right? Embracing the phase of maintenance to recognize that that is as much of a requirement inside your fat loss journey as the periods where like the weight is consistently coming off. And I would challenge anybody too. I've said this in my last few episodes. I've said it on Instagram a lot recently, but like harsh reality is if you didn't accomplish something in January of 2024, or at least like something you set as an intention back in January, and now we fast forward to December, if it didn't happen for you, it is probably not going to happen for you if you take the same mentality starting in January 2025. So knowing that that is true, what reason do you have to not start right now? And starting could look like exactly what you're saying. Can you just make sure there's protein on your plate? Starting doesn't require the 180, especially if you're talking to people like us.
Yeah. I mean, as you're saying that, it just reminds me, I've probably said this about 10,000 times at this point, but like if your plan starting this year was, I'm just going to make myself do it, like I just feel like now is the right time, and then you're going in like nothing happened this year that was significant, we're going into this next year saying, no, I really want it this year, I'm really going to make it happen. There's no fairy, there's no like snap your fingers and all of a sudden everything's going to work itself out. Clearly something's missing. Clearly
So
you
true.
don't know everything that you need to know. Otherwise, if you did, you wouldn't be listening to a podcast looking for health and
Yeah.
fitness tips. You'd be like, I'm good. I know what I need to do.
Right. Yeah, so true. And last two questions before we wrap this up. I wanted to come back to what you mentioned about being well versed in menopause and, staying up to date on like what's going on in your client's population. I'm curious for you, and I think this shines through in just your philosophies and everything you shared so far, but what are some of the ways that you really connect with your clients when they're going through that phase of life, knowing that you don't actually experience it firsthand yourself? Because I think there's sometimes unfairly an assumption that a male coach couldn't necessarily help you. And as we were talking in the beginning of this about your journey with working with the 40 plus female population, I actually started to like kind of go through and think about coaches I've had in the past. I've had my mix of nutrition coaches, both male and female, but interestingly with like trainers, I've always had a male coach in person. And I think there's something to be said for that, because I also just felt like they pushed me a little bit more. Not to say that the ladies can't, I push my clients, but it just like that light bulb kind of went off for me that I actually always gravitated towards that's what I preferred. So I'm curious for you, like, how do you think about that? What are some of the ways you talk to your clients when they're experiencing some of these symptoms that, you could talk to your mom, but you can't necessarily like feel physically?
Yeah, really, really good question. So first off, to your point about preferences, like everybody has their preferences. I've worked with people too that are just like, I don't know what it is. I just prefer a male trainer over a female one. No rhyme or reason, just like that's just how I prefer it. And it's kind of like dating. It's like, yeah, I gravitate towards this type of person instead of this type of person. Does it mean that you hate the other person? No. But and then it also comes down to acknowledging bias because at the end of the day, in other professions, like if you, for like an extreme example, does your like if you had cancer, does your doctor have to have had cancer for you to listen to them, or do they just have to be the best?
Yeah, such a good analogy.
And take it in a different direction, like if you went to the hairstylist and you know that the guy is the best one and you want to get his haircut that he specializes in
Yeah,
that the other ones suck at, are you going to say no, I want a lady because ladies get it better, or do you want the
right.
person that's going to
I've
get you
had
the
the
best
same guy
result?
cut my hair since I was 10, just putting it out there, and I'll never go to anybody
Exactly.
else.
Exactly. If I wanted like a Zohan haircut, I'd go to the Zohan. So, but I just frame it as like, listen, like when I'm talking to one of the ladies, I'm like, I'm your ultimate resource. I devote a lot of time and effort to learning this stuff. I
Mhm.
don't have the firsthand experience of feeling it. And honestly, I feel like that puts me in a power position because I have less bias. I'm not going to
Sure.
look at this through the lens of, well, this worked for me, so let me
True.
tell you,
Yeah,
which unfortunately there is a lot of that. But
there is.
so I just sit back and I'm like, listen, I have a lot of tools in the tool belt. You tell me what's going on, and we're going to try X, Y, and Z. And if it
Mhm.
works, awesome, we struck gold. And if it doesn't, I've got more tools in the tool belt that we can definitely try and implement them and see if they work. And eventually we're going to figure it out. But this is a collaborative thing. It's not just me saying I know it all.
Yeah, love that. I think that's so important because you're right. That bias of like assuming something's going to work for you, it's kind of hard to overcome that sometimes. Like just because it worked for you, like oh, it's definitely going to work for somebody else, and like that's definitely not the case. And I often will like I always say to the clients when they're in that phase of life, and I think unfortunately it's happening younger and younger for lots of different reasons that are becoming apparent and explainable, but saying to the person, first and foremost, let's just get a rock solid foundation on your day to day habits, on you managing your stress, on being consistent with your workout routine, maybe making some changes to the way you're training, but same with your nutrition, right? All of that. And then that's going to put us in a better position to explore some of these different options and really see that those options could work that much better for you. Because at the end of the day, let's say we're talking about, any kind of hormone therapies, unless we have everything else that I just mentioned, like good to go, that's still going to be just some kind of band aid.
100%. It's like it all depends on what the end result ends up being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true. And I think as a coach, that is also a good reminder that it's okay to change your mind. And it's also okay to remind the client that like the human body itself, because we are so individualized and it is a system, we have to be open to experimenting and recognizing that it's okay to experiment too, right? And like trying something for 4 to 6 weeks, trying something for 3 months, as long as we're on the same page of you giving it 100% effort, it's okay for us to then pivot and be like, all right, that you didn't respond to that the way we may have expected based on other information, so let's move on to the next thing.
Yeah, and it goes back to what we were talking about before, where it's like the only thing that matters in this entire thing is what is required to get the goal that you set out to achieve. And if we're doing that, then great. But you can't get caught up in like somebody telling you, "Oh, we're going to do it my way." It's like, "No, what do we need to achieve? X, Y, and Z. Does that require doing it this way or that way?" And if it requires that way, cool. If it doesn't, cool, we'll pivot. There needs to be flexibility and understanding, not just this like cookie cutter approach of like this is the only way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Last question. We obviously covered quite a bit of ground today. If somebody can only take away one thing from what you shared, one piece of advice, what are you leaving them with?
I'll leave it with a quote from one of my favorite coaches to listen to and read their books, Dan John. And if any coaches are
He's
listening
great.
right now and you don't know who Dan John is, you better learn because the guy is a world of wisdom. But he has a saying that is the goal is to keep the goal the goal.
Love
Don't
that.
tail off and fall for the shiny object. We're hitting Black Friday, we're hitting the holiday specials and all this stuff. There's going to be a million shiny objects out there. Always go at it with the frame of what do I want? what is required, and do I have the skills, the knowledge, and the tools that I need to achieve that?
So good. He has the best quotes.
He
Really
does.
does. They're so good.
He does.
It's like that's so obvious, but he just says it so well and in such a pointed way. So I couldn't agree with that more. And thank you for sharing that. If everybody wants to stay connected to you, listen to your podcast, follow you on social media, tell us where we can find you. And of course, I'll link it down in the show notes.
Of course. Well, I do have my own podcast, the Fit40 Podcast, and I would assume by this time, I'm going to have a pretty good guest on by then. I think you guys might be familiar with her, but yeah, Krysta's going to be on. So, and we already have done one, right? We've already had.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I actually recently aired our episode on my show. So I mentioned in that airing, it was like maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago from where we're recording this. So let's just say back in October, I kind of gave everybody the context and said that you were coming on the show soon too. So they got to hear you on the other side already. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, cool. Then we've already been there. So yeah, you guys can check hers out if you have not already. And I also have Instagram. It's just Bryan_Fit40, just FIT40, Bryan with a Y. And I have my Facebook group, the Fit40 family. So it's a fun time in there. We do monthly challenges. Check it out.
Nice. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you. It's always fun for us to chat and we need to do it more often. And for everybody who tuned in today, you guys know the drill. If there's anything in here that you thought was interesting, you could relate to, somebody else in your life could, share it, leave us a review. Make sure you follow Bryan. You can follow me at the Krysta Huber at the FYX.official pod. And from wherever you are listening from, we hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day and we'll catch you next week. Thanks, Bryan.
Thank you.